The latch clicked shut with a sound no louder than a pin dropping, yet it carried the weight of an iron door slamming closed forever. Brennan Mercer stood on the other side, the dust of the porch settling on his worn boots. The late September air was already thin and sharp, carrying the promise of hardship to come. He was 17 years old, and he had just become a stranger to the only home he had ever known. In his left hand, he clutched a small leather pouch containing $15, his entire severance from the world. In his right, a folded and brittle deed, the only other thing his father had given him from his grandmother's sparse effects. A man grown makes his own way, Ezra Mercer had said, his voice flat as slate, his eyes fixed on the far wall. He would not look at his son. Could not. One less mouth is a measurable gain in a year like this. There was no malice in the words. That was the worst part. Only the cold arithmetic of survival. The new wife had made her calculations clear, and Brennan was a number that did not add up in her favor. He did not look back at the house. He wanted to. God, how he wanted to. He wanted to see if his father might be watching from the window, might show some crack in that weathered face. But Brennan knew that if he turned, he would see only Willa, his 11-year-old sister, her small face pressed against the rippled glass, her palm flat against the pane, as if she could reach through and pull him back. Looking back was a luxury he could not afford. The road stretched before him, rutted and pale in the morning light, leading toward the town of Ridgecrest and whatever lay beyond. Brennan began to walk, and with each step he conducted an inventory of his entire world. One coat, threadbare at the elbows but still warm. 2 shirts, 1 pair of trousers besides the ones he wore. A tinderbox, a small knife with a blade that needed sharpening. $15 in worn coins and crumpled bills. And the deed. The deed felt like a mockery. His grandmother Astrid had left it to him when she died 2 winters ago, specifying in her broken English that it should go to the boy with the quiet eyes who listens. The family had laughed about it, a patch of stone and scrub that nobody had ever found a use for. A joke inheritance for a boy who spent too much time in the company of an old Norwegian woman and her strange stories. Brennan had never seen the land. He only knew what others said about it. The hollow stone claim, they called it, 60 acres of nothing. Rock and ravine and rattlesnakes. The walk to Ridgecrest took most of the morning. Brennan arrived as the sun reached its midday height, casting short shadows on the wooden sidewalks. The town was small but busy, a cluster of buildings serving the ranchers and miners and homesteaders who scratched their living from this hard Montana earth. He found the Mercantile without difficulty. It was the largest building on the main street, its windows crowded with goods, its door standing open to catch the autumn breeze. A bell chimed as he entered. Harlan Dawson stood behind the counter, a man of 55, with steel gray hair and spectacles perched on a nose that had been broken at least twice. He was sorting through a shipment of nails, his thick fingers moving with practiced efficiency. He looked up as Brennan approached, and his eyebrows rose. "Well now," Dawson said, setting down his work. "Ezra Mercer's boy, isn't it? Brennan?" "Yes, sir. Thought you'd be helping with the harvest out at your father's place." "I've left my father's place," Brennan said. The words came out steadier than he expected. "For good." Dawson's expression shifted, a flicker of understanding crossing his weathered face. News traveled fast in small towns, and Brennan suspected the man had already heard whispers about the new wife's preferences. "I see," Dawson said carefully. "Well, what can I do for you, son?" Brennan laid the deed on the counter. Dawson picked it up, peered at it over his spectacles. His thumb rubbed the faded ink, tracing the boundaries and notations that defined the property. His face changed as he read, settling into an expression of deep and genuine pity. "The hollow stone claim," he said, and the words came out like a sigh. "Son, I'm sorry for your grandmother's passing, but this," he shook his head slowly, "this is less than nothing. It's a tax burden. All rock and ravine, no water to speak of, no timber worth cutting. The only thing that land has ever been good for is sheltering rattlesnakes from the sun." He pushed his spectacles up and gestured to the shelves behind him, laden with sacks of flour, tins of coffee, tools that shone with a light coating of protective oil. $15 will get you a stagecoach ticket east," Dawson said, Maybe with a few meals to spare. That's the sensible play, son. Go somewhere with opportunity. This land will only kill you. Brennan looked at the bounty of the store. The smell of cured meats and dry goods filled the air, thick and comforting. He thought about the East, about cities full of strangers, about becoming another nameless body looking for work that might never come. Then he thought about his grandmother. He remembered her hands, gnarled and strong, showing him how to read the sky for weather. He remembered her voice, thick with the accent of her homeland, telling him stories of the old country. He remembered the way she had looked at him, really looked at him, when everyone else saw only a quiet boy with nothing special to offer. "I'll need a good axe," Brennan said. His voice was quiet but firm. "And a bow saw, a sack of flour, 50 pounds, a block of salt, and however many dried beans the rest will buy." Dawson stared at him. "Son," he said slowly, "did you hear what I just told you? That land is worthless. You'll be dead before Christmas." "That may be," Brennan said, "but it's mine." He pushed the $15 across the worn wood of the counter. Every coin, every crumpled bill, everything he had in the world. Dawson studied him for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression, moving from pity to something else. Not respect, exactly. More like a grudging acknowledgement of the boy's foolishness. "It'll leave you with nothing," he said. "I'm already there." The mercantile owner shook his head, but began to gather the supplies. He packed them in silence, the weight of his judgment heavier than the sack of flour Brennan would have to carry. As Brennan turned to leave, laden with his purchases, a voice called out from the back of the store. "That the Mercer boy?" Brennan turned. A man had emerged from the back room, a figure he recognized from town. Jedediah Crenshaw, a fur trapper in his early 40s, with a beard like rusted wire and eyes that had seen too many hard winters. "Headed out to that worthless claim his grandmother left him," Dawson said. "Going to homestead it, apparently." Jed Crenshaw laughed. It was not a kind sound. "The Hollowstone?" He stepped closer, looking Brennan up and down like a man appraising livestock. "Boy, that's nothing but a hole in a cliff. You planning to live in a cave like some kind of animal?" "I'm planning to survive," Brennan said. "Survive?" Jed spat a stream of tobacco juice into the spittoon by the door. "Let me tell you something, boy. I've trapped these mountains for 20 years. I've seen men come out here with more money, more experience, and more sense than you've got. And I've seen the spring thaw reveal their frozen bodies. That hole in the rock is going to be your grave before the new year. Mark my words." Brennan met the trapper's eyes. He saw the certainty there, the absolute conviction that he was speaking to a dead man walking. "We'll see," Brennan said. And he walked out into the autumn sunshine, the door swinging shut behind him. The journey to the Hollowstone claim took the better part of 2 days. Brennan walked the wagon-rutted road until it became a trail, and the trail until it became nothing but wild country. The weight of the flour sack on his back was a constant grinding burden, forcing him to stop and rest far more often than he wanted. The axe and saw, bundled together and slung over his shoulder, bit into his flesh with every step. The land grew steadily more hostile as he traveled. The fertile soil of the valley gave way to fractured stone and thorny scrub brush that tore at the hem of his trousers. This was the land the deed described, a place not meant for cultivation or comfort, but for endurance. The mountains rose around him, gray and indifferent, their peaks already dusted with the first snow of the coming winter. He saw no signs of human life, only a few resilient lizards basking on sun-warmed rocks. A hawk circling high overhead, a lonely sentinel in the vast empty blue. Once a rattlesnake coiled in the shadow of a boulder, its warning rattle sending him on a wide detour. On the first night, he made camp in a shallow depression between two large rocks, building a small fire and eating a handful of dried beans soaked in water from his canteen. The cold crept in as soon as the sun went down, seeping through his coat and into his bones. He did not sleep so much as drift in and out of a shivering half-consciousness, counting the hours until dawn. It was on the second day that he found the dog. He was crossing a dry stream bed when he heard the sound. A weak whimper, barely audible over the crunch of his boots on the gravel. He stopped listening and heard it again. Following the sound, he found a shape huddled beneath an overhang of rock. A dog, barely more than a puppy, with matted copper-colored fur and ribs that stood out like the bars of a cage. It looked up at him with eyes that held no hope, only a weary acceptance of whatever was to come. Brennan knelt down slowly. "Hey there," he said softly. "Hey, it's all right." The dog did not move, did not even wag its tail. It simply watched him with those exhausted eyes. Brennan reached into his pack and pulled out the last of the hardtack he had brought from home. He had been saving it, rationing it carefully, but looking at this creature, he found he could not eat while it starved. He broke the hardtack in half and held out a piece. The dog sniffed, hesitated. Then, with a movement that seemed to cost it tremendous effort, it stretched forward and took the food from his hand. Brennan fed it the other half. Then he sat down beside it and waited. An hour later, when he rose to continue his journey, the dog rose with him. "Copper," Brennan said, looking at the animal's rust-colored coat. "That's what I'll call you, Copper." The dog's tail moved. Just once. Just a little. But it was enough. They reached the hollow stone claim on the evening of the second day. Brennan saw the cliff first, a sheer face of gray, weathered granite rising from the earth like the wall of some ancient fortress. And at its base, exactly where the deed said it would be, a dark, yawning opening. The cave. His inheritance. He stood there for a long moment, Copper pressed against his leg, and felt the darkness of doubt creeping into his chest. Harlan Dawson was right. Jed Crenshaw was right. Everyone was right. It was nothing but a hole in a cliff, a home for snakes and shadows and the slow accumulation of bat droppings. The land around it was barren, hostile, utterly devoid of anything that might sustain human life. No trees close enough to matter, no visible water source, nothing but rock and scrub in the gathering darkness of evening. The wind picked up as the sun began to set, slicing through his coat with an invasive chill. Brennan looked around for shelter, for any alternative to the black mouth of the cave, and found nothing. No stand of trees, no natural windbreak. Nothing. He had no choice. Shouldering his supplies, he approached the entrance. Copper followed, close at his heels, a low whine building in the dog's throat. "I know," Brennan said. "I know, but there's nowhere else." He lit a small piece of tinder from his kit, the tiny flame flickering precariously in the wind. Then he stepped inside. The entrance tunnel was short, perhaps 30 feet, and he had to duck in places where the ceiling dipped low. The walls were rough but not jagged, smoothed by millennia of water that was no longer present. The ground beneath his feet shifted from rocky soil to a mix of sand and gravel. And then the tunnel opened up. Brennan stopped, stared. The flame in his hand illuminated a vast chamber, far larger than he had expected. The ceiling arched overhead like the vault of a cathedral, lost in shadows beyond the reach of his small light. The walls curved smoothly, shaped by forces he could not imagine, creating a space that felt almost intentional, almost designed. But it was not the size that stopped him. It was the air. Outside, the wind had been a knife, cold and cutting and relentless. But here, in this chamber of stone, the air was different. Not warm exactly, but still. Utterly, completely still. No draft, no chill. Just a cool, consistent temperature that seemed to wrap around him like a blanket. Brennan walked deeper into the chamber, his light pushing back the darkness. Copper padded beside him, no longer whining, his ears pricked forward with curiosity rather than fear. And then Brennan heard it, a sound, soft and rhythmic, a slow, patient dripping. He followed the echo, moving toward the back of the chamber, and found a dark fissure in the rear wall. From this fissure, a single drop of water emerged, caught the light of his flame, and fell with a clear, resonant plink into a small, shallow pool in the rock below. Water, clean, clear, untainted water, seeping from some hidden spring deep within the earth. Brennan touched his fingers to the rock wall beside the fissure. It was cool, not cold, but cool. A deep, steady coolness that seemed to radiate from the stone itself. He had heard his grandmother speak of this, of the way the earth held heat and cold, releasing it slowly across the seasons. Thermal mass, she had called it, the memory of summer stored in stone. He stood there in the darkness, his small flame guttering, and felt the first stirring of something he had not expected to feel. Hope. The townspeople saw a useless hole in the ground, a place of death and darkness. But they were wrong. This cave was not a grave. It was a buffer against the deadly freeze, a well that never ran dry, a root cellar carved by God himself into the living rock. The despair that had gripped him moments before began to recede, replaced by something harder, something with edges, resolve. "We can do this, Copper," he said softly, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "We can make this work." The dog pressed his warm body against Brennan's leg and let out a soft whine of understanding. And for the first time since the latch had clicked shut behind him, Brennan Mercer felt the solid ground of possibility beneath his feet. He explored the cave more thoroughly the next morning, using precious matches to light his way into its deeper recesses. Most of it was empty. Vast chambers connected by narrow passages, the stone formations speaking of ages beyond human comprehension. But in a small alcove near the main chamber, hidden behind a fall of rock that looked almost deliberate, he found something that made his heart stop. A tin box, old and rusted, but still intact. Someone had placed it here, wedged into a crack in the stone where it would be protected from moisture and time. Brennan pried it open with trembling fingers. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had mostly preserved them, were two items: a folded piece of paper covered in faded handwriting, and a rough sketch drawn in charcoal on what looked like the back of a feed sack. The handwriting was his grandmother's. He would have recognized those cramped, careful letters anywhere. The English was imperfect, the spelling sometimes creative, but the meaning was clear. "My grandson," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means you have come to the hollow stone when no one else believed you should. It means you have the courage I always saw in you, the quiet strength that others mistake for weakness. This cave saved my life in the winter of 1848. I was alone then, as you may be alone now. Everyone I came with had died in the crossing, and I had nothing but my knowledge and my will to survive. The people in the valley thought I was mad to stay here. They called me the crazy Norwegian woman. They said I would die, but I did not die. The cave taught me its secrets, and I am leaving them here for you. Build your cabin against the mouth of the cave, sealing the entrance. Let the cabin face the morning sun for light and warmth. Let the cave be the heart of your home, the cool, steady center that does not change with the seasons. The stone holds the warmth of summer and releases it in winter. The water never freezes, never stops. Plant in the soil near the entrance where a little light reaches. Keep your animals in the deeper chambers where the temperature never falls below what they can survive. Trust what others cannot see. Your grandmother, Astrid." Brennan read the letter 3 times. Then he unfolded the sketch and studied it in the dim light filtering through the cave entrance. It was a plan, a simple but clear drawing showing how his grandmother had configured her own survival. A cabin built against the cliff face, its back wall the living rock itself. A chimney venting through a natural fissure. Animal pens in the cave beyond. Raised beds for planting near the light. She had done this. 50 years ago, a young woman alone in a hostile land had stood where he was standing and had refused to die, and she had left him the map to follow. Brennan pressed the letter to his chest and felt tears burn in his eyes. He let them fall. There was no one here to see. No one but Copper, who pressed against his leg and whined softly. "Thank you, Bestemor," he whispered, using the Norwegian words she had taught him. "Grandmother. Thank you." The work ahead would be harder than anything he had ever imagined. He knew that. But now he had something more valuable than money or tools or even food. He had knowledge. And knowledge, his grandmother had always said, was the only inheritance that could never be taken away. What would you do in Brennan's place? Would you trust the words of a grandmother you barely remembered? Or would you take your chances on the road east? Think about it for a moment before we continue. The first week was a testament to the brutal honesty of labor. Each morning, Brennan woke with his muscles screaming, his hands raw and blistered, and each morning he rose to face the relentless demands of his new reality. There was no room for self-pity, no time for doubt. There was only the work, and the work was everything. His plan was simple in concept, monumental in execution. The cave would be the core of his home, the protected and stable environment that would keep him alive through the winter. But the cave mouth was too large, too open to the elements. He needed to build a cabin against the cliff face, sealing the entrance and creating a two-chambered dwelling. The cabin would face the morning sun, providing light and whatever warmth the pale winter rays could offer. The cave behind it would remain the dark, cool heart of the operation. He began with the trees. There was a small grove of hardy pine a quarter-mile down the ravine, stunted by the harsh conditions but still tall enough to provide usable timber. Brennan had never felled a tree in his life, but his father had been a man who believed in observing process, even if he rarely explained it. Brennan remembered the way Ezra Mercer would size up a trunk, the way he would cut the notch to guide the fall, the angle of the back cut that sent the tree crashing down in a controlled direction. His first attempts were disasters. The bough saw caught and stuck in the green wood. His axe strokes were inefficient, glancing off the trunk at wrong angles, jarring his arms with each impact. He cut the notch too shallow, and the first tree he tried to fell twisted as it went down, nearly crushing him beneath its unexpected trajectory. But he was methodical. He studied his failures, adjusted his technique, found the rhythm of the blade, the way to let the weight of the tool do the work rather than fighting against it. Learned to read the lean of a tree, to anticipate where it wanted to fall, and work with that natural inclination rather than against it. The sound of the first tree groaning, cracking, and finally crashing to the earth was both terrifying and deeply satisfying. It was the first tangible piece of his new world. Copper watched from a safe distance, his copper-colored ears pricked forward. Each time a tree went down, the dog would let out a soft bark of approval, his whole body wiggling with excitement. Getting the logs to the building site was another brutal challenge. Brennan could not lift them, not even close. A single pine log, even stripped of its branches, weighed more than he did. So he learned the art of leverage. He used smaller branches as rollers, placing them beneath the logs and pushing, the timber moving inch by agonizing inch across the rocky ground. He cut pathways through the brush, clearing obstacles that would catch and hold his cargo. He used the natural slope of the land, positioning logs at the top of rises and letting gravity assist his labor. Every log represented a day of sweat and strain. By the end of the first week, he had a dozen of them, stripped of their branches and lying like fallen giants near the mouth of the cave. His hands were a ruin of broken blisters and raw flesh. His back ached with a deep, persistent pain that no amount of rest could fully ease. He had lost weight he could not afford to lose, his already lean frame growing sharper at the edges. But when he looked at those logs, he felt something that might have been pride. The foundation came next. He spent days gathering flat, heavy stones from the surrounding area, hauling them back to the building site one at a time. His grandmother's sketch showed the cabin anchored to the cliff face, its side walls extending outward to create an enclosed space. He needed a level base for these walls, a platform of stone that would keep the wooden structure off the damp ground. He measured the perimeter not with a ruler, but with his own paces. 12 steps long, 8 steps wide. It was small, barely room for a man to turn around, but it would be his. The stones were stubborn, refusing to settle evenly, shifting and sliding as he tried to arrange them. He spent hours adjusting, levering, shimming with smaller rocks until each piece lay flat and stable. The work destroyed his fingernails and left his arms trembling with exhaustion. But slowly, painfully, the foundation took shape. During this time, he lived on a thin gruel of flour and water, cooked over a small fire he built each night, just inside the cave entrance. The heat from the fire was swallowed by the vast chamber, but the smoke rose and found its way out through fissures in the rock above. A natural ventilation system that his grandmother had clearly discovered decades before. The food was not enough. He knew that. The work demanded calories he did not have, and he felt his strength beginning to wane. But the sight of the growing pile of logs, the neat rectangle of foundation stones, was a different kind of nourishment. It was proof. Proof that his decision was not folly. Proof that his labor could impose order on this hostile piece of earth. Proof that he was more than what the people of Ridgecrest believed him to be. He had no one to praise him, no one to offer a word of encouragement. The only sounds were the wind, the scrape of his tools, and the steady, patient drip of water in the darkness behind him. Copper slept curled against his side each night, a warm presence in the cold, and Brennan found himself talking to the dog as he worked, explaining his plans, describing his grandmother's sketch, sometimes just narrating his own actions, filling the silence with the sound of a human voice. "Tomorrow we start on the walls," he said one evening, stroking the dog's ears as the fire crackled before them. "That's going to be the hard part, getting those logs up and notched. But we'll figure it out, we have to." Copper lifted his head and licked Brennan's face, his tongue warm and rough. "I'll take that as agreement," Brennan said, and for the first time in weeks, he smiled. That night, unable to sleep, Brennan sat by the fire and thought about what lay ahead. His grandmother had been part of a chain, a link connecting the wisdom of centuries to the present day. And now, whether he wanted it or not, Brennan was the next link. The responsibility weighed on him. He was 17 years old. He had no formal education beyond what the one-room schoolhouse in his hometown had provided. He could read and write in cipher, but he had never studied architecture or engineering or any of the sciences that might explain why his grandmother's methods worked. All he had was the knowledge itself, practical, tested, proven through generations of survival. Was that enough? "What do you think, boy?" he asked softly, scratching behind Copper's ears. "Am I doing this right? Would grandmother be proud?" The dog's tail thumped against the stone floor. "I'll take that as a yes." He thought about his mother, who had died when he was 8, about the long nights she had spent coughing, the blood on her handkerchiefs, the way she had grown thinner and paler until one morning she simply did not wake up. He thought about his grandmother, who had stepped into that void and filled it with her stories, her wisdom, her fierce Norwegian stubbornness. He thought about his father, who had never recovered from his wife's death, who had retreated into silence and work, and eventually into the arms of another woman who had no room in her heart for another woman's son. He thought about Willa, his sister, still trapped in that house, still pressing her face against windows and watching the people she loved walk away. "I'll come back for you," he whispered into the darkness. "When I can, when I have something to offer, I'll come back." It was a promise he did not know if he could keep, but it was a promise he intended to try. The first wall rose with agonizing slowness. Hoisting the heavy notched logs into place was a puzzle of leverage and brute force that Brennan had to solve anew with each timber. He devised a simple A-frame derrick using his precious rope and the strength of a nearby stunted tree as an anchor. The process was fraught with risk. A single slip, a single failure of the rope or the anchor could send a log crashing down and destroy his work, or worse, himself. He moved with excruciating care. Each timber that settled into place was a victory measured in inches. The notches he cut were crude, learned through trial and error, but they held. The corners of his cabin began to take shape, one layer at a time, rising from the foundation like the skeleton of something that might one day be a home. After days of this grueling work, 4 rough walls stood against the gray stone of the cliff. They were not pretty. The gaps between the logs were wide and uneven, some large enough to admit a fist. But they were walls. They had integrity. They would stand. Brennan spent the next 2 days chinking. It was a messy, laborious task. He mixed the sandy soil with water from the cave spring and dried grasses from the ravine, creating a thick mud that he forced into every crack and crevice. The work was cold and unpleasant, his fingers growing numb in the wet slurry, the mud seeping into his clothes and caking on his skin. But as the gaps filled, the cabin began to feel less like a collection of logs and more like a room. The wind no longer whistled through it. The outside world was being held at bay. On the morning he started the roof, Jed Crenshaw appeared. The trapper came riding up the ravine on a mule, his rifle across his saddle, his eyes scanning the landscape for game. He stopped when he saw Brennan standing on a makeshift scaffold, fitting a roof beam into place. "Well, I'll be damned," Jed said, spitting tobacco juice onto the rocky ground. "The boy's still alive." To him, Brennan did not stop working. "Mr. Crenshaw, what in God's name are you building out here?" "A house," Jed laughed. It was the same unkind sound Brennan remembered from the mercantile. "A house? Against a cave?" He shook his head slowly, his beard wagging. Boy, I've seen some foolish things in my years, but this takes the prize. You're building yourself a coffin is what you're doing. When that first real cold snap hits, this pile of sticks is going to be about as useful as a paper coat in a blizzard. Brennan continued fitting the beam. His arms burned with the effort, but his voice remained steady. We'll see. We'll see, Jed mimicked. That's all you've got to say? Boy, I'm trying to help you here. There's still time to walk away. Come back to town. Find work on one of the ranches. You're young and strong, and clearly not afraid of labor. Why throw your life away on this? Brennan paused then. He looked down at the trapper, at the weathered face that held genuine concern beneath the mockery. Because it's mine, he said simply, and because my grandmother survived a winter here with less than I have. If she could do it, so can I. Jed's expression shifted. Something flickered in his eyes. Curiosity, perhaps, or the first stirring of doubt in his certainty. But then he shook his head again, dismissing whatever thought had crossed his mind. Your funeral, boy. Your funeral. He rode away without looking back, and Brennan returned to his work. The fireplace nearly broke him. He had saved it for last, knowing it would be the most difficult and the most critical. Without heat, nothing else mattered. The walls and roof were merely decorations for a frozen grave. His grandmother's sketch showed the chimney venting through a natural fissure in the cliff face behind the cabin. Brennan found the fissure easily enough, a narrow crack in the rock that seemed to pull air upward when he held a flame near its opening. Nature had done most of the work. He needed only to connect it to a hearth. He used the flattest stones he could find, carefully stacking them with the same mud mixture he had used for chinking. The construction was crude, held together more by gravity than by any real mortar. But he followed the basic principles he had observed in the fireplaces of his childhood home. When the hearth was complete, he built a small test fire. The cabin filled with smoke, thick, choking clouds of it, pouring from the fireplace as if the chimney simply did not exist. Brennan stumbled outside, coughing, his eyes streaming, and stood in the cold autumn air, feeling the familiar shadow of failure pressing down on him. He had done something wrong, something fundamental, and he did not know what it was. The voice in his head whispered that he was a fool, that everyone was right, that he would die here alone and unmourned. The voice that sounded uncomfortably like his father. Copper whined and pressed against his leg. Brennan looked down at the dog, took a breath, then another. All right, he said, his voice hoarse from the smoke. All right, let's figure this out. He went back inside, enduring the lingering smoke, and examined the fireplace carefully. He traced the path from hearth to fissure, running his hands along the stones, looking for the flaw. He found it near the top, a blockage, a place where the stones had shifted, narrowing the passage until it was barely wider than his fist. The smoke could not escape fast enough, and so it backed up into the room. It took him 2 hours to dismantle the upper portion of the chimney and rebuild it, widening the passage, ensuring each stone was firmly seated. When he finished, his hands were torn and bleeding from the rough rock, and the sun was setting beyond the mountains. He built another fire. This time the smoke drew upward. A thin gray plume disappeared into the fissure in the rock, and a steady, radiant heat began to fill the small space. Brennan sat before the crackling flames, the warmth seeping into his aching bones, and felt tears running down his cheeks. He did not try to stop them. There was no one here to see, no one but Copper, who lay beside him, nose resting on his paws, eyes reflecting the firelight. He had done it. The cabin was not finished, not really. There was still a door to build, still a window to frame, still 100 details to address. But the essential thing, the thing that would keep him alive, was complete. He had built a home. And sitting there in the warmth, listening to the fire crackle and the wind moan impotently outside, Brennan allowed himself to feel something he had not felt since the latch clicked shut behind him. He allowed himself to feel that he might actually survive. Have you ever worked towards something so hard that everyone said you would fail? That moment when you prove them wrong, even if only to yourself, is something you never forget. Brennan was about to face that moment again, but on a much larger scale. The trip back to Ridgecrest was a necessary evil. Brennan had used the last of his flour, and his diet of forage roots and the occasional rabbit copper managed to catch was not enough to sustain him through the heavy labor ahead. More importantly, he needed livestock. The cave system, with its stable temperature and protection from the elements, was perfect for sheltering animals through the winter. But animals cost money. He had exactly $3 left. $3 he had found in the pocket of his coat, forgotten there since the previous spring when his father had sent him to town for supplies. It was not much, but it might be enough. The walk took a full day, his pace faster now that he was not laden with supplies. He arrived in Ridgecrest as the afternoon light was turning golden, his body harder and leaner than it had been a month ago, his hands calloused and scarred. People stopped to stare as he walked down the main street. He could hear the whispers following him like a wake. The Mercer boy, the one living in the cave. Still alive, can you believe it? He ignored them and walked into Dawson's Mercantile. The bell chimed. Harlan Dawson looked up from his ledger, and his eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. "Well," he said, setting down his pen, "the cave dweller returns. I figured the coyotes had gotten you by now." "Not yet," Brennan said. A few other people were in the store. Brennan recognized them all, if not by name then by face. Ridgecrest was a small town. Everyone knew everyone, or at least knew of them. One of them was Jed Crenshaw, examining a new trap near the back wall. He turned at the sound of Brennan's voice, and his expression was one of undisguised astonishment. "You're still going?" he said. "I rode past your place 2 weeks ago. Figured you'd have given up by now." "I finished the cabin," Brennan said, "and the fireplace. They work." Jed's eyes narrowed. Something shifted in his face, a crack in his certainty that he quickly plastered over. "Yeah, well, winter hasn't started yet. Wait until the real cold comes, then we'll see how your little project holds up." Brennan turned back to Dawson. "I need 4 laying hens," he said, "and a pair of sheep. 1 ewe, 1 ram, and another 10 pounds of salt." A murmur rippled through the store. Even Dawson looked taken aback. "Son," he said slowly, "that's everything you have and more. The animals alone will take every cent, and you'll still be short. You're throwing good money after bad. Those animals will freeze to death before the new year." "They won't," Brennan said. "The cave stays warm, around 54 degrees all year round. My grandmother documented it." "Your grandmother was a—" Dawson stopped himself, but the word hung in the air anyway. Everyone knew what people had called Astrid Lindquist when she was alive. Crazy, touched, the mad Norwegian woman who talked to herself and lived in a hole in the ground. "She was right," Brennan said quietly, "about everything." The door to the Mercantile opened and a woman stepped inside. Brennan did not recognize her, but he noticed the way she carried herself, straight-backed and proud despite clothes that showed careful mending. Her hair was the color of winter wheat, and her eyes were a pale blue that seemed to see more than they should. "Ingrid," Dawson said, nodding to her. "What can I get you?" The woman did not answer. She was staring at Brennan, her expression unreadable. "You are building against the cave," she said. Her accent was faint but unmistakable. Norwegian, like his grandmother's. "Yes, ma'am. With the hearth venting through the fissure, and pens for animals in the deeper chambers." Brennan felt a chill run down his spine. "How do you know that?" "Because my bestemor built the same way in Trondheim." The woman's voice was soft, almost reverent. "I thought no one remembered. I thought it was all lost." She stepped closer, studying his face as if searching for something. "Your grandmother," she said. "She was Astrid Lindquist?" "Yes, ma'am. She raised me mostly, after my mother died." The woman's eyes glistened. She reached out and gripped his arm, her fingers surprisingly strong. "Then you have the knowledge," she said. "The old knowledge. The things the people here have forgotten or never knew." She turned to Dawson, her voice firm. "Give him what he needs. I will cover what he cannot pay." The Mercantile fell silent. Dawson stared at the woman. "Ingrid, you can barely—" "I will cover it," she repeated. "This boy is building something that matters, something that could save lives. I will not let money stand in the way of that." Brennan tried to protest, but she silenced him with a look. "You can repay me in spring," she said, "with the first lamb your ewe bears. That is fair, yes?" It was more than fair. It was generosity beyond anything he had experienced in his young life. "Yes, ma'am," he managed. "Thank you." Ingrid Lund nodded once, then turned and walked out of the store without another word. The bell chimed behind her, and a long silence followed. "Well," Dawson said finally, his voice gruff, "you heard the woman? Let's get you your animals." Before Brennan could leave with his purchases, another figure entered the mercantile. Reverend Whitmore was a tall man, thin as a rail, with eyes that burned with the fervor of his calling. He served the congregation of Ridgecrest and the scattered homesteads around it, riding a circuit that brought him to every soul in need of salvation. "Young man," the Reverend said, his Bible clutched to his chest, "I have heard troubling reports about your situation." Brennan waited, saying nothing. "That you are living in a cave, like an animal, rejecting the society of your fellow man and the comfort of proper Christian dwellings." "I'm living in a cabin, sir. The cave is just storage and shelter for my animals. The Lord did not intend for man to live in holes in the ground." Whitmore's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "It is ungodly, unnatural. You should return to town, find honest work, live among decent people." Brennan met the Reverend's eyes. "With respect, Reverend, the Lord also created the cave, and the stone that holds heat, and the water that flows from it year-round." He gathered his supplies. "My grandmother survived a winter there. She said God put this shelter here for those who needed it. I'm inclined to believe her." He walked out before Whitmore could respond. Behind him, he heard Opal Gentry, the woman who ran the boarding house, whisper to her companion, "Poor thing, lost his mother, cast out by his father, and now this. The boy has clearly lost his mind to grief." Brennan kept walking. The journey back was excruciatingly slow. The sheep protested every step, bleating their displeasure at being led away from the familiar fields around town. The chickens, crated and slung across his back, clucked in constant alarm. Copper circled the small flock endlessly, his herding instincts awakened, nipping at hooves and keeping the procession moving. But as they finally crested the last rise and the cliff face came into view, something changed. The sheep fell quiet. Their ears pricked forward, and they moved more willingly, as if sensing the shelter ahead. The chickens settled in their crate, their agitated clucking fading to occasional murmurs. When Brennan led them through the heavy plank door he had hung just 2 days before, and into the surprising stillness of the cave, a quiet sense of triumph settled over him. The sheep immediately began exploring their new pen, nosing at the dry ground and the pile of dried grass he had gathered. The chickens, released from their crate, fluffed their feathers and began pecking curiously at the gravel. Outside, the world saw him as a fool destined to perish. Inside, his system was complete. The month of November passed in a rhythm of labor and survival. Brennan expanded the animal pens, building low fences from woven saplings to create separate areas for the sheep and chickens. He hauled bucket after bucket of richer soil from a sheltered pocket of the ravine, creating raised beds in the front section of the cave, where a sliver of ambient light reached. He planted the carrot seeds and winter lettuce that Ingrid Lund had pressed into his hand as he left town, a gift he had not asked for and could not refuse. It was a desperate gamble, an experiment in subterranean agriculture born of necessity. But his grandmother's letter had mentioned it, and he trusted her word. He fell into a routine. Wake before dawn, stoke the fire in the cabin, check the animals, water the garden beds, tend to whatever maintenance the harsh environment demanded. Eat, work, eat again, sleep. The loneliness was immense, a physical weight that pressed on him from all sides. Days passed without hearing another human voice. The only sounds were the wind, the drip of water, the bleat of sheep, and the crackle of fire. But he was not lonely in the way he had been at his father's house. There, loneliness had been the feeling of being unseen among people who should have seen him. Here, alone by choice and circumstance, the solitude felt different, cleaner somehow, more honest. On a gray morning in late November, old Silas Whitfield appeared. He was 74 years old, bent and weathered by decades of hard living, but his eyes were still sharp. He had been among the first settlers in the valley, back when the nearest town was 100 miles away, and the only law was what a man could enforce with his own 2 hands. He stood in front of Brennan's cabin for a long time, saying nothing, his rheumy eyes taking in every detail. "You the Mercer boy?" he finally asked. "Yes, sir." "The one building against the cave?" "Yes, sir." The old man nodded slowly. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice was steady. Ain't seen construction like this in 40 years, he said. Maybe more. Used to be common, back before the railroads came and everyone forgot the old ways. He reached out and touched the chinked logs, running his fingers over the mud mixture. Earth and grass. No lime. No mortar. Just what the land provides. My grandmother showed me, Brennan said. Or her letters did anyway. She said this is how they built in the old country. Norway? Yes, sir. Silas Whitfield nodded again. His eyes were distant, seeing something from long ago. My first winter in this valley, I built a soddy, he said, dug into a hillside and roofed it with earth. Everyone else built proper cabins, wood frames and all. Most of them died that winter. The cold got in through every crack. But my soddy, with all that earth holding the heat, he trailed off, then refocused on Brennan. The land remembers, boy, even if people forget. Will you come inside? Brennan asked. I can make coffee. The old man smiled, revealing teeth worn down to nubs. I believe I will. They sat by the fire. Copper stretched between them and talked for hours. Silas Whitfield knew things. Things about the land, about survival, about the ways that wisdom could be passed from generation to generation, only to be lost when people stopped listening. He talked about his own grandmother, a woman from the hills of Scotland who had taught him to read weather in the clouds and approaching storms in the behavior of animals. The young folk now, he said, shaking his head, they think they know everything. Think books and schools can teach them what centuries of living taught our ancestors. They build their houses with no thought to the wind, no thought to the cold, and then they're surprised when winter kills them. Why don't they listen? Brennan asked. Because listening means admitting you don't know, and that's hard for people. Silas took a sip of his coffee and winced at the weakness of it. Pride, boy. Pride kills more men than cold ever did. He stayed until late afternoon, then rose to leave. You've built well, he said at the door, pulling his coat tight against the chill. Better than I expected for a boy your age. But the winter ain't started yet. The real cold is coming. You feel it in the air? Brennan did feel it, had felt it for days. A pressure, a weight, a sense of something enormous gathering just beyond the horizon. I feel it, he said. Good. Silas Whitfield met his eyes, and there was something in his gaze that might have been respect. Then you might just make it. You might just prove them all wrong. He walked away into the gathering dusk, and Brennan watched him go. Then he turned back to his cabin, to his cave, to the system he had built against the lethal temperatures that were coming. And he got back to work. The sky changed on December 20th. The blue faded to gray, then to a strange yellowish white that Brennan had never seen before. The air grew heavy, thick with a pressure that made his ears ache. The wind, which had been a constant companion, fell silent. Too silent. Copper would not settle. He paced the cabin restlessly, whining, pressing against Brennan's legs whenever his master stopped moving. The sheep in their cave pen huddled together, their eyes wide and rolling. The chickens refused to leave their roost. Old Silas Whitfield's words echoed in Brennan's mind. The real cold is coming. You feel it in the air? He felt it now. He spent the day in preparation, hauling firewood into the cabin until it was stacked against every available wall, checking the animals, ensuring their water was full and their feed was accessible, sealing every gap he could find in the cabin walls, stuffing rags and grass into the smallest cracks. As night fell, the first flakes began to drift down from that strange yellow sky. They were not the gentle flakes of a picturesque snowfall. They were small and hard, like grains of sand, driven by a wind that rose from nothing to a shriek in the space of an hour. Brennan barred the door with a heavy log. He checked the fire one last time. Then he sat down in his chair. Copper pressed against his legs and waited. The storm hit like a fist. When was the last time you felt a storm coming in your bones? That sense of something massive approaching, something you couldn't stop, only prepare for? That's where Brennan was now, and what was coming would test everything he had built. The blizzard was not weather. It was war. The wind did not blow. It attacked, hurling itself against the cabin walls with a fury that seemed personal, as if the storm itself had taken offense at Brennan's refusal to die. The snow did not fall. It flew horizontal, a blinding, scouring force that erased the world beyond the small window. Inside the cabin, the contrast was almost surreal. The fire crackled steadily, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. The air was warm, scented with pine smoke and the stew that simmered over the flames. Brennan sat in his chair, wrapped in a blanket, and listened to the storm rage impotently outside. His grandmother had been right. The cabin, backed against the living rock of the cliff, was holding. The stone absorbed the heat of the fire and radiated it back, creating a warmth that the wind could not steal. The thick, chinked walls blocked the gusts that would have found every crack in a conventional structure. The tons of snow piling against the outer walls only added another layer of insulation. He walked into the cave. The transition was jarring. In the cabin, he could hear the storm, could feel its presence pressing against the walls. But in the cave, the storm did not exist. There was no sound of wind, no sense of the violence outside, just the steady drip of water into the stone basin and the peaceful sounds of animals at rest. The sheep chewed their cud placidly, their warm breath misting slightly in the cool cave air. The chickens were asleep, heads tucked under wings. The raised beds showed the pale green of growing things, impossibly alive in the dead of winter. Brennan placed his hand on the stone wall. It was cool, unchanged, eternal. This rock had endured 1,000 such storms, 1,000,000. His cabin was just a fragile, wooden shell, but it was anchored to this immovable certainty. He was not fighting the storm. He was simply outside of its reach, a passenger in an ark of stone. The storm raged for 3 days without pause. On the 4th day, it intensified. The temperature dropped from merely dangerous to actively lethal. Brennan's small window, which had been covered with snow since the first night, now bore a thick layer of ice on its inner surface. The air outside had grown so cold that the snow no longer fell as flakes but as tiny frozen crystals, a glittering death that the wind drove into every unprotected surface. He knew from the pressure changes he could feel in his ears that this was not an ordinary blizzard. This was something worse, something historic. And he wondered in the quiet hours of the night how the people of Ridgecrest were faring. On the evening of the 5th day, Brennan heard something through the howl of the storm. At first, he thought it was just another sound in the symphony of wind and groaning timber. But Copper's ears pricked forward, and a low growl built in the dog's throat. Then it came again, a rhythmic sound, a desperate beat against the heavy plank door. Human. Brennan's first instinct was fear. In the month he had lived here, he had grown accustomed to isolation. The outside world had become abstract, a memory of places and people that no longer touched his daily existence. An intrusion now in the middle of a killing storm felt like a violation. But then the sound came again, weaker this time, followed by a muffled cry that the wind almost swallowed. Someone was dying on his doorstep. Brennan rose, his heart pounding. He took the iron poker from beside the fireplace and gripped it tight. Then he lifted the heavy log that barred the door and pulled it open just enough to see. A figure fell into the room. It was more a mound of snow and ice than a person, a shape so encrusted with frozen white that no features were visible. It collapsed onto the floor and lay still, and for a terrible moment Brennan thought he was looking at a corpse. Then the shape moved, groaned, tried to speak. Brennan slammed the door against the storm and dragged the figure toward the fire. As the snow melted away, he recognized the face beneath. Jed Crenshaw. The trapper's skin was blue-white, his lips cracked and frozen, his beard a mass of ice. His eyes were barely open, unfocused, seeing nothing. "I know this trail," Jed managed between chattering teeth. "Rode past here enough times mocking you. Never thought I'd be crawling back, begging for shelter." He coughed, a dry, rattling sound that spoke of lungs struggling to function. "Storm let up for maybe 10 minutes around noon. Saw your smoke against the cliff. Followed it like a dying man follows a lantern." He coughed again, his whole body shaking. "Wagon," he rasped. "Dawson and his wife. Overturned, 2 miles east. Saw them on my way here. They were still alive then. Barely." Brennan's mind raced. Dawson, the mercantile owner, and his wife. 2 people lost in this storm, probably already dying. He could do nothing. could stay here in his warm sanctuary and let nature take its course. They had mocked him, called him a fool, predicted his death with confident certainty. He looked at Jed, lying on his floor, the man who had said this cave would be his grave. Then he looked at the fire, at the warmth, at the safety his grandmother's knowledge had given him. And he thought of her words, written in that letter he had read 100 times. Trust what others cannot see. But there was something else, something she had told him when he was very young, sitting on her knee in the cabin that was no longer his home. Brennan, she had said, the measure of a person is not what they do when others are watching. It is what they do when they are alone with their choices, when no one will ever know. That is when you find out who you really are. He knelt beside Jed and pulled the frozen coat from the man's shoulders. Stay here, he said, his voice steady, despite the fear that churned in his gut. Stay by the fire. I'm going to find them. Jed's hand shot out, gripping Brennan's arm with surprising strength. You'll die out there, he whispered. It's death. Pure death. Maybe, Brennan said, but I have to try. He rose and began to dress for the impossible. The cold hit him like a physical blow the moment he stepped outside. It was not wind. It was not weather. It was a force of nature so hostile, so fundamentally opposed to human life, that his first breath seared his lungs and his second nearly dropped him to his knees. He had wrapped himself in every layer of clothing he possessed. A scarf covered his face until only his eyes were exposed, and even those watered and stung against the assault of the wind. He carried a lantern, though its flame guttered dangerously, and a coil of rope and a pot of hot stew sealed tight. The world had become a white void. There was no horizon, no landmark, no way to orient himself except by keeping the cliff face to his left. He staggered forward, each step a battle against the wind that tried to knock him down and the snow that threatened to swallow him whole. Jed had said 2 miles east. 2 miles. In normal conditions, a 20-minute walk. In this, it might as well have been 100. Brennan pressed on. He could not feel his feet after the first quarter mile. His hands, even in their thick gloves, had begun to lose sensation. The cold was not just around him, but inside him, seeping through every layer, reaching for his core heat with patient, deadly fingers. But he kept moving. One step, then another, then another. He thought of his grandmother, alone in this valley 50 years ago. He thought of Willa, his sister, her face pressed against the glass. He thought of Copper, waiting in the warm cabin. He thought of all the people who had told him he would die out here, and he decided that he would not give them the satisfaction. Not today. He found the wagon after what felt like hours. It was barely visible, a dark shape nearly buried in a drift. Huddled in its lee, partially sheltered from the wind, were 2 figures locked in a desperate embrace, Harlan and Cordelia Dawson. Their faces were masks of shock and disbelief as Brennan's lantern light fell upon them. They had given up. He could see it in their eyes. They had accepted death, and now this impossible apparition had appeared from the white void. There was no time for words. Brennan got them to their feet, half carrying Cordelia, when her legs refused to support her. Harlan was stronger but barely, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated. They formed a chain, Brennan in front, following the cliff face back the way he had come. The return journey was worse. He was tired now, his reserves of strength depleted by the outward trek. The added weight of supporting the Dawsons slowed him further. Every step was agony. Every breath was fire. But the cliff face did not lie. It led him home. When they finally stumbled through the cabin door, when the warmth and quiet closed around them like a benediction, Cordelia Dawson began to weep. Great, racking sobs that shook her entire body. Brennan did not stop to comfort her. He stripped off their frozen outer garments, pressed warm cups of stew into their shaking hands, and piled every blanket he had around them. Only when they were settled, when the color began to return to their faces and their shivering started to ease, did he allow himself to collapse into his chair. Copper climbed into his lap, whining softly. "I know, boy," Brennan whispered, stroking the dog's fur with fingers he could barely feel. "I know, but we did it." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside there was warmth, there was life, there was survival. And that, Brennan thought, was all that mattered. Harlan Dawson did not speak for nearly an hour. He sat by the fire, wrapped in blankets, staring into the flames with an expression Brennan could not read. His wife had fallen into an exhausted sleep beside him, her breathing finally steady and deep. When he did speak, his voice was rough, broken by more than just the cold. "We were on our way back from Miller's Creek," he said. "Supplies for the store. The storm came up faster than we expected. We tried to make it home, but the horses couldn't see the road. They wandered off the trail, and the next thing we knew, the wagon hit a drift and went over." He paused, swallowing hard. "We couldn't right it, couldn't find our bearings. We just huddled there, waiting to die." His eyes finally left the fire and found Brennan. "How did you know we were out there?" "Jed Crenshaw. He made it here first. Told me about your wagon." Dawson's face went pale. "Jed is alive?" "In the cave, with the animals. It's warmer there than you'd think." For a long moment, Dawson said nothing. Then slowly he rose to his feet. "Show me." Brennan led him through the inner door, into the cave. He watched the older man's face as he took in the scene. The sheep in their pen, placid and comfortable. The chickens roosting peacefully. The raised beds where pale green shoots pushed through the dark soil. The steady drip of water into the stone basin. The dry floor, the stable temperature, the absolute absence of the storm that still raged outside. And Jed Crenshaw, wrapped in blankets, sleeping soundly beside the animal pens. Dawson stood there for a long time, saying nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "We called you a fool." Brennan did not respond. "We said this cave would be your grave. We laughed about it. Took bets on when you'd give up or freeze to death." Dawson turned to face him, and his eyes were wet. "We were the fools. We were the ones who couldn't see." "There's stew," Brennan said quietly. "Eat, rest. The storm will pass." He turned and walked back into the cabin, leaving Dawson alone with his revelation. Sometimes the greatest vindication comes not from words but from silence, from simply being right when everyone said you were wrong. Brennan had earned that moment, but for him it wasn't about being right. It was about survival, his own and others. That distinction would define everything that came after. The storm lasted 9 days. 9 days of howling wind and frozen death. 9 days of snow that buried the world under a white blanket 4 feet deep. 9 days that would be remembered in Ridgecrest for generations as the Great Blizzard of 1879. Inside Brennan's cave-backed cabin, time moved differently. More people came. On the 6th day, Reverend Whitmore arrived with 3 members of his congregation, all of them half frozen and desperate. The man who had called Brennan's dwelling ungodly now knelt before the fire and wept with gratitude. On the 7th day, Boone Hollister stumbled through the door, his face white with frostbite, 2 of his fingers blackened by the cold. He was the young ranch hand who had bet $5 that Brennan wouldn't survive until November. He did not mention the bet now. On the 8th day, Opal Gentry arrived, the woman who had whispered that Brennan had lost his mind with grief. She brought with her a 7-year-old girl named Emma, a child she had found wandering the edge of town, separated from her parents in the chaos of the storm. The girl did not speak for 6 hours. She sat in a corner, wrapped in blankets, staring at nothing, her small body shaking with a trauma deeper than cold. Brennan watched her with growing concern, uncertain what to do, how to reach her. It was Copper who finally broke through. The dog approached the girl slowly, belly low to the ground, tail wagging hesitantly. Emma's eyes focused on him, the first real awareness she had shown since arriving. Copper crept closer, closer, until his nose touched her hand. "Can I pet him?" Emma whispered. It was the first thing she had said. "Of course," Brennan said. Emma's small hand reached out and touched Copper's head. Copper's whole body wiggled with happiness, his tongue lolling out in a doggy grin, and the ghost of a smile flickered across the girl's face. "What's his name?" "Copper." "That's a good name." She scratched behind his ears and Copper groaned with pleasure. "He's warm." "He is." Emma looked up at Brennan, and her eyes were clearer now, more present. "My mama and papa," she said. "Are they going to find me?" Brennan knelt down beside her. "When the storm passes," he said, "we'll make sure they do, I promise." He did not know if he could keep that promise. did not know if Emma's parents were even still alive. But in that moment, it was what she needed to hear. Emma nodded and went back to petting Copper, and Brennan added another weight to the burden he carried, another life he was responsible for, another reason to ensure they all survived. By the 9th day, there were 11 people in Brennan's home. 11 people, crammed into a cabin built for one. 11 people sharing the food he had stored, the water from the cave spring, the warmth of his fire. 11 people who had called him a fool, or at least had not objected when others did. The food was running low. Brennan did the math in his head and did not like the numbers. His provisions had been calculated for one person and one dog over one winter. 11 people, even for a few days, would consume what had taken him months to accumulate. But he did not ration, did not calculate who deserved what. He simply fed them all, watching his stores dwindle, and trusted that somehow, some way, it would be enough. On the morning of the 10th day, Brennan woke to silence. Not the muffled quiet of the cave, but a different silence, an absence. He lay in his bedroll for a moment, trying to identify what had changed. The wind had stopped. He rose and went to the door, lifting the heavy bar and pulling it open. The world outside had been transformed. The snow stretched away in every direction, a pristine white blanket that glittered under a sky of piercing blue. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across a landscape that looked nothing like the one he remembered. Drifts rose like frozen waves, some taller than a man. The air was cold but still, and the silence was so complete that Brennan could hear his own heartbeat. One by one, the others gathered behind him, staring at the alien beauty of the storm's aftermath. "It's over," Cordelia Dawson whispered. But it wasn't over. Not really. The storm had passed, but its consequences were only beginning to be understood. The death toll, when it was finally counted, stood at 47. 47 souls across the county, frozen in their homes or lost in the white void, or simply unable to endure the 9 days of bitter freeze. Most of them were the very young or the very old, but not all. Strong men had died, healthy women, people who had done everything right by the standards of the time, and still had not been enough. Among the survivors, the losses were almost as devastating. Cattle frozen in fields by the thousands, horses dead in their barns, sheep, pigs, chickens, all the animals that represented wealth and sustenance, wiped out in a single week of weather. The survivors gathered what remained and tried to rebuild. It was a slow, painful process. Families who had lost everything huddled in the homes of those who still had walls standing. Men who had been proud and independent now accepted charity with bowed heads and quiet thanks. Women who had never known want learned to stretch a single meal across 3 days. The church became a distribution center, with Reverend Whitmore coordinating the delivery of supplies from larger towns to the east. Dawson's Mercantile extended credit to anyone who asked, keeping careful records in a ledger that everyone knew would never be fully repaid. And through it all, the story spread. The boy at Hollow Stone, the one who built his house against a cave, the one who saved the Dawsons and the trapper and the Reverend and all those others, the one who had vegetables growing in the middle of winter, livestock healthy and warm, water that never froze. At first, people spoke of it with disbelief, then with curiosity, then with something approaching reverence. How did he know, they asked each other. How could a 17-year-old boy know what none of us knew? The answer, when it came, was both simple and profound. He listened. He listened to his grandmother when everyone else dismissed her as a crazy old woman. He listened to the land when everyone else tried to bend it to their will. He listened to the stone and the water and the earth, and they told him secrets that books could never teach. In a valley full of people who thought they knew better, Brennan Mercer had been humble enough to learn, and that humility had saved lives. But at Hollow Stone, nothing had died. Brennan's sheep were healthy, his chickens still laying, his garden still growing in the impossible warmth of the cave. He had enough food to last until spring, assuming he was careful. More importantly, he had something that could not be measured in bushels or head of livestock. He had proven something. They left in groups as the roads became passable. Jed Crenshaw was the last to go. He stood at Brennan's door, his hat in his hands, his eyes fixed on his boots. "I owe you my life," he said. "You don't owe me anything." "I do." Jed looked up, and his face was harder to read now, complex in a way it had not been before. I told you this place would be your grave. I meant it. I was sure of it. He shook his head slowly. I was wrong. About this place. About you. About everything. People are wrong sometimes, Brennan said. It doesn't make them bad people. Jed considered this for a moment. No, he said finally, but it does make them responsible for what they do next. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. This is for you. Call it payment for my passage through the storm. Brennan took the pouch, felt the weight of coins inside. Jed, don't argue, just take it. The trapper put his hat back on and turned to go. Then he paused, looking back over his shoulder. You know, your grandmother, the Norwegian woman. I met her once, years ago. She was buying supplies in town and everyone was whispering about her. Crazy woman, mad woman, living in a hole in the ground. I remember, Brennan said softly. I was there. She looked at me, Jed continued, right at me, and she smiled, like she knew something I didn't, like she was sorry for me. He shook his head. I never forgot that look, never understood it until now. He walked away without another word, and Brennan watched him go, thinking about his grandmother, about the smile Jed had described, about the quiet wisdom of a woman who had known what others could not see. Epilogue. The Hollowstone spring came late that year, the snow lingering well into April before finally releasing its grip on the land. But when the thaw finally arrived, it brought something more than just warmth. It brought people. They came to Hollowstone in ones and twos at first, then in larger groups. Ranchers and homesteaders, farmers and laborers, all of them curious about the boy who had survived the great blizzard when so many others had not. They came to see, to learn, to understand. Brennan showed them everything. He took them into the cave and explained how the earth held a constant temperature, how the stone absorbed summer heat and released it through the winter. He showed them his chimney, venting through the natural fissure, drawing smoke upward without losing the precious warmth. He demonstrated his raised beds, where vegetables grew in the cave's dim light. Nourished by soil he had carried in bucket by bucket, he held nothing back. My grandmother knew these things, he told them. She learned them from her grandmother, who learned them from hers. This is not new knowledge. It's old knowledge that people forgot. Some of them listened. Some of them nodded and went back to their conventional homes, unwilling to change what they had always done. But some of them understood. Some of them began to build differently, to think differently, to prepare for winters yet to come. By summer, 6 new cave-back structures had been started in the valley. By the following winter, those structures held families who would survive the cold without losing a single member to the frost. Harlan Dawson came to visit in July. He brought supplies, flour, salt, coffee, and other goods that Brennan had depleted during the storm. He refused payment. Consider it an investment, he said, in the future of this valley, in what you're building here. What am I building? Dawson looked around at the cabin, at the cliff face, at the land that everyone had called worthless. Something that matters, he said, something that will outlast both of us. He also brought news. Reverend Whitmore had resigned his position, unable to reconcile his experience in the cave with his previous condemnation of it. He had left Ridgecrest and was reportedly working as a missionary in the Eastern Territories, preaching a more humble gospel than before. Boone Hollister had lost 3 fingers to the frostbite he had suffered. But he had also lost something else, his arrogance. He was working now as a hand on Dawson's ranch, quiet and respectful, a different man than the one who had wagered $5 on Brennan's death. Old Silas Whitfield had passed peacefully in his sleep 2 weeks after the storm. He had left instructions for his burial, asking to be laid to rest on the ridge overlooking Hollowstone. He said you were the only one who understood, Dawson told Brennan, the only one who remembered what mattered. Brennan said nothing, but later that day he climbed to the ridge and stood beside the freshly turned earth, looking down at the home he had built. Thank you, he said softly, for seeing what others couldn't. The wind carried his words away, but he liked to think that somewhere, somehow, Silas Whitfield heard them. Ingrid Lund became a regular visitor to Hollowstone. She came with her son, a boy of 10 named Eric, and together they learned the old ways that both their grandmothers had known. Brennan found himself teaching, something he had never expected to do, passing on knowledge that had nearly been lost. You should write it down, Ingrid said one afternoon, watching as Eric practiced cutting notches for a log joint. All of this, everything your grandmother knew, so it isn't lost again? I'm not much of a writer. Then draw, sketch, whatever you can do. But preserve it, Brennan. This is too important to exist only in memory. That night, by the light of his fire, Brennan began to write. He started with his grandmother's letter, copying it word for word into a leather-bound journal that Ingrid had given him. Then he added his own observations, his own drawings, his own hard-won understanding of how to survive in a land that wanted to kill you. The journal grew slowly, one page at a time, one season at a time. It would never be finished. There was always more to learn, more to record, more to pass on. But it was a start. If this story has touched you, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Have you ever known someone like Brennan? Someone who listened when others wouldn't? Someone who held on to old knowledge that others dismissed? Share your story. And if you know someone who has ever been told their dreams were foolish, who has ever been mocked for doing things differently, share this with them. Sometimes we all need a reminder that the people who change the world are rarely the ones who follow the crowd. In the autumn of 1881, 2 years after the Great Blizzard, Brennan received a visitor he had not expected. He heard the wagon before he saw it. Ingrid Lund's old mare, pulling the same cart she used to bring supplies from town. But when the wagon crested the rise, it was not Ingrid who sat beside the driver. It was a girl, 12 years old now, with eyes he would have recognized anywhere. The driver, Ingrid's son, Eric, now a young man of 14, helped the girl down from the seat. "Found her at Dawson's Mercantile," he called out. "Said she was looking for her brother at Hollow Stone. Mrs. Lund told me to bring her straight here." Willa Mercer stood before him, taller than he remembered, her face carrying a solemnity that seemed too old for her years. "Willa?" His voice came out as a whisper. "Hello, Brennan." He stepped back, letting her enter, his mind reeling with questions. She walked into the cabin, looking around with wide eyes, taking in everything he had built. "It's warm," she said, "even though there's no fire lit." "The stone holds the heat. I'll explain later." "Willa, why are you—" "Papa is sick," she said, turning to face him. "The coughing illness. The doctor says he won't see another winter." Brennan felt the words hit him like stones, one at a time. Papa. Sick. Won't see another winter. "He sent me," Willa continued. "He wanted me to give you this." She reached into her coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Brennan took it with numb fingers and opened it. The handwriting was his father's, shaky, uncertain, but unmistakably Ezra Mercer's hand. "Son," it read, "I have not been a good father to you. I know that. I made choices I am not proud of, choices that put you out into the world before you were ready. I told myself it was for the best, that you would find your way, that I had no other option. These were lies I told myself so I could sleep at night. The truth is, I was weak. I let another person's wishes override my own judgment, my own duty to my blood, and I have regretted it every day since. I heard about what you built, about the storm, about the people you saved. The whole county is talking about the Mercer boy at Hollowstone, the one who proved everyone wrong. I am proud of you, son, more proud than I have words to say. I am sending Willa to you because I know she will be safe with you, because I know you will teach her what I never could, because I trust you with the most precious thing I have left in this world. Forgive me if you can, forget me if you cannot, but take care of your sister, your father, Ezra." Brennan read the letter twice, 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in his pocket, next to the letter from his grandmother. 2 letters, 2 inheritances, one of knowledge, one of love. "You're staying," he said. It was not a question. "If you'll have me." He looked at his sister, at the girl who had pressed her hand against the glass as he walked away, at the young woman she was becoming. "Of course," he said. "Of course I'll have you. This is your home now." Willa smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through clouds after a long storm. "Show me," she said. "Show me everything." And so he did. Brennan Mercer lived at Hollowstone for the rest of his life. He married in 1885 a school teacher from the East named Clara, who had come to Ridgecrest to bring education to the frontier children. She fell in love with his quiet strength, his patient wisdom, his deep respect for the land and its secrets. Together they raised 4 children in the cave-back cabin. Each of them learned the old ways, the knowledge that Brennan had inherited from his grandmother and passed on to the next generation. Willa stayed at Hollowstone until she married at 19, a carpenter named Thomas who learned the old building methods and incorporated them into every structure he raised. Their children grew up knowing what their uncle knew, what their great-great-grandmother had known, what centuries of survivors had passed down through blood and memory. Copper died in 1893, at the age of 14. He passed peacefully in his sleep, curled in his favorite spot by the fire, his muzzle gray and his eyes clouded by age. Brennan buried him at the entrance to the cave, marking the grave with a stone carved by his own hand. Copper, 1879 to 1893, the most faithful friend. He stood there for a long time after the burial, remembering the starving puppy he had found on the road, the companion who had shared his solitude, the warm presence that had gotten him through the darkest days. "Thank you, boy," he whispered, "for everything." Brennan himself passed in 1929, at the age of 67. He died in the cabin he had built 50 years before, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. The fire was burning in the hearth. The warmth of the stone walls surrounded him. Through the window, he could see the land he had made his own, the land that everyone had said would kill him. His last words were for Clara, who held his hand as he faded. "Tell them to keep building," he said. "Tell them to remember." "I will," she promised. "I will." He smiled, closed his eyes, and found peace at last. The cabin at Hollowstone still stands today. It has been repaired and restored over the years, but the basic structure remains the same. The logs Brennan cut with his own hands, the chimney he built from flat stones and mud, the cave beyond, with its constant temperature and endless water. In 1978, researchers from Montana State University came to study the structure. They measured the temperatures inside during the coldest days of winter and found exactly what Brennan's grandmother had documented a century before. The cave held a steady 54 degrees, regardless of the conditions outside. The stone walls of the cabin retained heat with an efficiency that modern architects could only admire. They found something else as well. Carved into the wall of the cave, in letters worn smooth by time, were Brennan's meticulous records. Temperature readings spanning 6 decades. Observations about weather patterns, animal behavior, crop yields. A lifetime of knowledge etched into the living rock. "This is remarkable," the lead researcher said, running her fingers over the faded carvings. This man was conducting scientific research before the discipline even existed. He was documenting principles of thermal mass and passive heating that we're only now beginning to understand. The research team published their findings in a scientific journal. Brennan Mercer, the 17-year-old boy who had built a house against a cave because his grandmother told him to, was cited as a pioneer of sustainable architecture. He would have laughed at that. All he had wanted was to survive. But survival, as it turns out, is only the beginning. Brennan Mercer built more than a house. He built a legacy, a way of living with the land instead of fighting against it, a philosophy of humility and preparation that his descendants carry with them to this day. His journal, the one Ingrid Lund convinced him to start, is now in the collection of the Montana Historical Society. Researchers still study it, still find wisdom in its pages, still marvel at the combination of practical knowledge and quiet dignity that fills every entry. The Hollowstone settlement he established grew over the years into a small community. His children and grandchildren built their own homes against the cliff face, each one incorporating the lessons he had taught them. When the harsh winters came, as they always did, the people of Hollowstone were ready, not because they were stronger or smarter than anyone else, but because they remembered. They remembered that the old ways had value, that the knowledge of grandmothers and grandfathers passed down through generations was not superstition, but survival. That sometimes the wisest thing a person can do is listen to those who came before. In the end, what did Brennan Mercer prove? He proved that a boy of 17, cast out with nothing but $15 and a worthless piece of land, could build a life that would endure for generations. He proved that knowledge, the right knowledge, was worth more than money or tools or social acceptance. He proved that the measure of a person is not what they do when others are watching, but what they do when they are alone with their choices. And he proved, perhaps most importantly, that a cave is not a grave. A cave is whatever you make of it. For Brennan Mercer, it was a home, a sanctuary, a place where the impossible became possible, where a legacy was born, where generations of his descendants would learn what it truly means to survive. His grandmother had known it, had seen it somehow, decades before he was born. Trust what others cannot see, she had written. Brennan trusted. And the hollow stones stand still. The end. Thank you for listening to this story. If it moved you, if it made you think about the wisdom of those who came before us, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, sometimes the things that others call worthless are the very things that can save us. We just have to be humble enough to see it.